Welcome to Anews. I'm Umar Taslim and you're watching Turkish Diplomacy. The crisis in Gaza is escalating as Israeli ministers push for full occupation and new settlements. Over 61,000 Palestinians have been killed, more than 2 million displaced, and aid remains far below survival levels. Today, I'll be discussing Israel's deepening offensive and how rising tensions from Ukraine to Syria are reshaping regional geopolitics. Joining me on today's program are Anews editor Mustafa Kocakanar and Dr. Valeria Janota, the scientific director of the Turkey Observatory at Centro Studi di Politica Internazionale.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Sunday he expected to complete a new Gaza offensive fairly quickly, as the UN Security Council heard new demands for an end to suffering in the Palestinian enclave. Netanyahu, speaking after his security cabinet on Friday approved a much-criticized plan to take control of Gaza City, said he had no choice but to complete the job and defeat Hamas to free hostages seized from Israel.
Israel's security cabinet instructed the IDF to dismantle the 2 remaining Hamas strongholds in Gaza City and the central camps. Contrary to false claims, this is the best way to end the war and the best way to end it speedily.
Hamas says it will not disarm unless an independent Palestinian state is established. It was not clear when the offensive would begin. European representatives at the United Nations said famine was unfolding in Gaza, and Israel's plan would only make things worse. Here's Slovenia's Samuel Zhabogar.
Expanding military operations will only endanger the lives of all civilians in Gaza, including the remaining hostages, and result in further unnecessary suffering.
Malnutrition is widespread in the enclave due to what international aid agencies say is a deliberate plan by Israel to restrict aid. Netanyahu said Israel was working with Washington on creating a surge of aid into Gaza, including by land. His office said he spoke with U.S. President Donald Trump late Sunday to update him on Israel's plans.
Welcome back to the program. Dr. Valeria and Mustafa Kocakanar, welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Now, Mustafa, I'll start with you first. Tell me about the latest developments. Now, we've seen over the past 24 hours, there were some statements coming from the Israeli cabinet. Most importantly, the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, he has said that Netanyahu needs to fully occupy the Gaza Strip rather than doing it step by step. Now, Mustafa, also we saw yesterday that 5 journalists were also killed in an Israeli airstrike. They were correspondents for Al Jazeera, the Qatari channel. Mustafa, tell me about the latest developments. What have we seen over the last 24 hours?
Umar, first of all, I would like to wish Allah's mercy upon Turkish citizen who lost his life during yesterday's earthquake in Balıkesir province. I am sending my sincere condolences to the deceased Turkish citizens' families. And as you know, Israel's war cabinet has recently approved embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's decision to fully occupy the Gaza Strip. But we know that Israel is in political turmoil right now, and there is a rift between Israeli political leaders and armed decision makers. As you know, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in favor of gradual occupation in the Gaza Strip. On the other hand, far-right figures within the Israeli war cabinet have been pushing for immediate occupation in the Gaza Strip. They are also calling for annexation of the West Bank. And on the other hand, army chief is against Netanyahu's occupation plan in the Gaza Strip. He is citing that Netanyahu's plan lacks of strategic objectives and strategic activities. It is clearly showing that Israel is in a political turmoil right now. But I think that if we want to understand Israel's political motivations in the region, we have to delve into the political reasons behind Netanyahu's decision. We are always mentioning that Israeli decision makers have been striving to make Israel the only regional hegemon in the Middle East, and it is already related to security architecture in the region. And the second reason is the political domestic dynamic within Israel. We know that Israeli the citizens have been always taking to the streets to express their frustration over Netanyahu's policies in the region. They are calling Netanyahu as a crime minister instead of prime minister, because we know that there is ongoing corruption trial against Netanyahu. On the other hand, on the international level, there is an arrest warrant for Netanyahu by the ICC, and it is clearly showing that Israel is being diplomatically isolated from the international community. On the other hand, Netanyahu is suffering from public support within Israel, and I think that Israeli decision makers and Netanyahu think that the continued military activities in the region are the best option for Netanyahu to keep him politically alive within the country.
Dr. Valeria, how are you analyzing the situation now? 61,000 people have been killed by the Israeli military. 2 million have been displaced. There is little to no aid, and we've seen how the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has been operating, killing people who have been queuing for humanitarian aid. Now, we saw yesterday as well, now another 5 journalists have been killed. Now, Israel is killing the messengers, but it cannot kill the message, right? How are you analyzing the latest situation, Valeria?
Actually, well, thank you for the question, and actually my sincere geçmiş to Turkey and the affected people by the earthquake. Coming to your question, I'm not really surprised how Israel is performing and acting, because I do believe that it's not the clear intention is the democratic shift of the region and of Palestine. Actually, Israel would like to be dominant in the Gaza Strip and in Gaza City. And to some extent, it feels protected and strong because it's backed by US and some other small allies. So this is the political aim and the strategical aim. However, I do believe also that international community is becoming much more aware than before. If we look at what's happening in Europe, for example, in the West in general, nowadays there are many more countries, states standing against Israel by recognizing as well the Palestinian as a state within the UN General Assembly. I refer also to France, unexpectedly, but also the most recent statement by German Chancellor Scholz. It came also by Spain, by Sweden, and recently this morning also New Zealand stood up. So I think there is much more awareness. Of course, there is also a sort of frustration because we are all aware that we are acting within an international system where the international architecture is not effective any longer. Yesterday we had the UN Security Council meeting, but still, despite the evidence is clear in front of our eyes, there is no mechanism able to prevent a further escalation or restraint Israel or punishing Israel, by the way, in this government. As Mustafa said before, domestically, there is also a huge polarization, political polarization and public polarization against what the government of Israel is doing right now. But unfortunately, if we look at the situation from a realist point of view as a scholar of international relations, we can expect just a further escalation as long as there is no a common point where all these states that they are becoming much more aware they can stand against Israel in order to counterbalance it.
Now, Valeria, like I said in the beginning of the program, the cabinet members are forcing Netanyahu to go for a full occupation plan because Netanyahu initially stated that he will start with Gaza City. Now, if he goes ahead with this plan, which obviously the United States is supporting Netanyahu and other Western countries are also supporting, despite them saying that we're going to recognize the state of Palestine, they're still supporting the Israeli government. What would happen if Netanyahu goes ahead with this complete occupation of the Gaza Strip?
I think some new actors may arise as guarantor of the new situation that eventually will occur in the Gaza Strip. I can think about Qatar. I can think about Egypt, that already there are some signals in this way. Also, in this catastrophic scenario, I do believe that Turkey may play a role. I mean, by calling back the rationality of the international community, as Turkey has been always doing since the eruption of the conflict back in 7th of October 2024, like being very vocal in denouncing the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza and these kind of things. So I do believe that at a certain point a mechanism somehow should be established in order to contain further the Israel maneuver, and in also to guarantee a sort of balance. If we can speak about balance, I'm not sure in what really is happening in the region. But definitely, as I mentioned before, I think the main aim of Israel is the democratic shifting in the region. So definitely imposing the Israeli presence in the Gaza City, in the Gaza Strip, and then imposing also the presence of the colonial, basically.
Mustafa, what about the international, exposure that the public is gaining now? Now they're shifting. When we first saw, when the war started in October 2023, we saw that many people across the Western countries were supporting Israeli actions. They were in favor of Israel attacking the Gazans. How has that changed, Mustafa, over the past 2 years? What have we seen? We've seen public pressure growing in countries like France, UK, and the country which has become the latest country is Australia, which says that it's going to recognize the state of Palestine at the UN General Assembly next month. How are you looking at the public narrative, Mustafa? How has that changed over the past 2 years?
Right now, I think pro-Palestinian movement is gaining momentum worldwide, and international criticism is mounting on Israel over the deteriorating and dire humanitarian conditions in the occupied Gaza Strip. And as you know, French President Emmanuel Macron last month announced his government's decision to recognize the Palestinian statehood on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly meeting in September. On the other hand, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer also announced the United Kingdom's intention to recognize the legitimate rights of the Palestinians unless Israel takes concrete steps over a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. And as far as I know, Canada and Australia are planning to join these countries in terms of recognizing the Palestinian statehood. And it is evident that a pro-Palestinian movement is gaining international momentum right now. On the other hand, we know that some Western countries, including Spain and Norway, have already recognized the Palestinian statehood. On the other hand, as we know that Turkey has been always calling for two-state solution to the decades-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been always advocating for the Palestinian statehood based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. It is clearly showing that Turkey's diplomatic initiatives are yielding positive results in terms of upholding the Palestinian cause and Palestinian rights. But on the other hand, there is also a United States factor. And following France and United Kingdom's decision, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio immediately criticized these countries for taking steps in terms of ensuring peace and stability in the Middle East. As you know, the United States is always against the unilateral recognition of the Palestinian statehood. And yesterday, at the United Nations Security Council, United States rejected genocide allegations against Israel over the Gaza Strip. And it is clearly showing that there is hypocrisy among American decision makers right now. On the other hand, we know that U.S. President Donald Trump welcomed Israel's embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu several times to the White House this year. He is always reaffirming United States ironclad support for Israel's so-called national security demands in the region. Yes, recognition is important for upholding the Palestinian rights, but I think that only recognition or condemnation do not yield positive results in terms of ensuring peace and stability in the occupied Palestinian territories. I think we have to see more concrete steps from the international community if we want to see long-standing peace and tranquility in the Middle East. I think concrete steps can include arms embargo, economic sanctions, or cutting military ties with this Middle Eastern country. As you know, Turkey has already halted its trade activities with Israel, and Turkish decision makers have been calling for regional unity and solidarity in terms of addressing security challenges posed by the Israeli decision makers. I think that the international community will be supposed to take Turkey's security demands into the consideration consideration if they want to see a long-standing peace and stability in the Middle East.
Valeria, this Friday we're expecting a meeting between Trump and Putin. That's going to be held in Alaska. Do you think that we will be able to find a way out of this war? Do you think that there's going to be a ceasefire? What demands could Russia bring to the table?
Well, it's a $1,000 million question, you know, because anything is becoming transactional in this international system we are living in, and the diplomacy became leader-to-leader diplomacy. So the fact that after many statements, after many promises, Trump will be able to meet Putin means something. The fact that Ukraine President Zelensky is not involved in a meeting means also something, because I think the two warring parties should meet up and discuss, by the way. As Zelensky said, there is no solution without the Ukrainian side involved. However, we had many mediation attempts led by Turkey here in Istanbul, so I think already the discussions and conditions are on the table, even though a definitive ceasefire looks far away. What will happen, we don't really know, because I do believe that Russia put very strong and tough conditions on the table. He's asking about neutrality around his own territory and neutrality overall of Ukraine. And nowadays, this neutrality cannot be done, because already the diplomatic community in the West in general has been engaging Ukraine within its own framework. For example, just after the eruption of the war, of the conflict, the European Union submitted the candidacy to Ukraine in order to become a full EU member, and still the process is going on. Ukraine as well has been dependent by foreign aid and Western aid in terms of armaments and weapons and things like that. So again, we are seeing that the Western Bloc is not keen to engage Russia in any discussion. So I'm not sure whether Trump will represent all the international community, but definitely out of the meeting in Alaska, something more concrete than before will come up.
So what could be the consequences for Ukraine as a result of this meeting?
Well, right now it seems that there are three different approaches to the Ukraine-Russia war, and the first approach is the American one. And we know that during his presidential campaign last year, U.S. President Donald Trump promised to put an end to the ongoing conflicts between Ukraine and Russia within 24 hours. And he started his second presidency at the White House in January, and right now we are in August. But we know that on the ground, war between Ukraine and Russia is raging on the Eastern Europe, and it is clearly showing that Trump failed to promise his foreign policy goals. At the end of February, as you know, U.S. President Donald Trump and his Vice President J.D. Vance diplomatically humiliated Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in front of the international media. And following this process, we know that the Trump administration decided to suspend some military support for Ukraine. But following the geopolitical tensions in the Middle East, I think Trump started to change his approach to the Ukraine-Russia war, because we know that Trump learned something from the geopolitical escalation between Israel and Iran. As you know, Israel launched unprecedented strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, military installations, and oil refineries. And United States also joined Israel's military campaign against Iran in terms of obliterating Iran's nuclear program. And the American military intervention paved the way for the ceasefire between Iran and Israel. I think Trump learned something from that crisis, and it is escalation for de-escalation. And last month, Trump decided to send Patriot missile defense systems to Ukraine to defend itself against Russian military aggression. On the other hand, he threatened Russia and its economic partners to impose economic sanctions. And it paved the way for the meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. And this Friday, these nations, these leaders are set to meet with each other in Alaska. I don't think that we can expect any diplomatic breakthrough from these negotiations, because they are excluding Ukraine from the negotiating table. And on the other hand, the second approach is the European one, and European countries have been always reaffirming their strong support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. They are also claiming that Ukraine should sit at the negotiating table, but on the other hand, they are eager to exclude Russia from the negotiating table. And the third approach is the Turkish one. Turkey, since the very beginning of the crisis, has been pursuing balanced approach to the Ukraine-Russia war. Turkey has been always claiming that there will be no losers in just peace and there will be no winners in the continued military activities. As you know, Turkey's Istanbul hosted several rounds of peace negotiations between Ukrainian and Russian delegations. Yes, maybe these negotiations didn't yield positive results in terms of reaching a ceasefire or peace deal, but these negotiations contributed to the confidence-building measures among warring sides. And we know that Turkey has been enjoying close relationships with both Ukraine and Russia in many fields, ranging from politics and economy to trade and military. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been always calling for leader-to-leader diplomacy to reach a ceasefire or peace deal. We know that Turkish decision makers have been trying to bring Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Russian leader Vladimir Putin, and US President Donald Trump together in Istanbul or Ankara to discuss what can be done to reach a ceasefire or peace deal. And we know that international community is praising Turkey's balanced approach to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. As you know, in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, and no one from Western countries and Turkey is recognizing the illegal annexation of the Crimea by the Russian Federation. And to this week's meetings, I think territory swap discussions will be on the table between Putin and Trump. And we know that right now Trump administration is eager to recognize the Russian annexation of Crimea. I think that it will not yield positive results in terms of ensuring Ukraine's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. On the other hand, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reiterated his country's determination to protect his country's political sovereignty and territorial integrity. Right now, there are several demands coming from both sides, and as you know, Russia is calling upon Ukraine to give up its political sovereignty and territorial integrity. On the other hand, Ukraine is asking for the full withdrawal of the Russian military forces from the occupied territories. I think these security demands need to be reconciled by the regional or international stakeholders. And long story short, I can clearly say that it is up to Turkey right now to mediate or facilitate diplomatic talks between Ukraine and Russia in terms of reaching a long-standing ceasefire or peace deal.
Mustafa and Valeria, thank you for that analysis. We'll be right back with you guys. European leaders have voiced strong support for providing Kyiv with robust and credible security guarantees, emphasizing the need to uphold Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity amid ongoing conflict with Russia.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Sunday welcomed a joint statement by European leaders pushing for the protection of Ukrainian interests. It follows a video message on Saturday in which Zelensky said a meeting in Britain of representatives from Ukraine, Europe, the UK and US was constructive. US Vice President J.D. Vance was among them, along with British Foreign Secretary David Lammy, who was hosting Vance and his family during their visit to England. The meeting came after US President Donald Trump announced face-to-face talks with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in Alaska on August 15th. The British and European leaders, including from France, Italy, Germany, Poland, Finland and the European Commission, on Saturday welcomed Trump's efforts to end the war. But they also stressed the need to pressure Russia and give Kyiv robust and credible security guarantees, adding that, quote, they remain committed to the principle that international borders must not be changed by force. On Sunday, Zelensky said in a social media post that Ukraine values and fully supports their statement, saying, quote, "The end of the war must be fair, and I'm grateful to everyone who stands with Ukraine and our people today for the sake of peace in Ukraine, which is defending the vital security interests of our European nations."
It's very complicated, but
Trump on Friday talked up the prospect of a deal to resolve the 3.5-year-old conflict.
there'll be some swapping of territories to the betterment of both.
Zelensky and his European allies have warned that any deal requiring Ukraine to surrender significant parts of its territory would only encourage Russian aggression. Meanwhile, Europe has put forward a counter-proposal, a European official said, declining to provide details. The Wall Street Journal said it included demands that any territorial exchange must be reciprocal, with firm security guarantees. The White House did not immediately respond when asked about the counter-proposal.
Welcome back to the program. Dr. Valeria, at the start of this month, Turkish President Erdogan met with the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, and the Libyan Prime Minister, Mohamed Dabibe. And this was a very constructive meeting. It revolved around energy security, migration, and Mediterranean. Tell us more about this meeting. What was discussed and what is the aim of all of these three countries?
Actually, yes, as the 1st of August, all three leaders met here in Istanbul, and it was the new format, a sort of tripartite meeting, discussing many common issues, relevant also in terms of regional stability. The focus was definitely Libya and the stability of Libya, where many challenges are coming from. Migration was one of the hottest topics. Actually, for Italy, migration is of crucial importance because still nowadays we are witnessing many migrants coming towards Italy. And according to the recent data, in the last 6 months, more or less, around 40,000 migrants landed to Italy, and half of them came from Libya. So for Meloni, this is a priority. And they are pivoting on the good synergies and complementarities with Turkey. Already in the past, between Rome and Ankara, some agreements have been signed related to the containment of migration flow coming from Libya, because Italy is pretty much aware that Turkey has a great influence in Libya in terms of security and in terms of stability after overall the memorandum of understanding, which was signed back in 2019. So migration was one of the hottest issues, but as well, what involves Libya, Turkey, and Italy is the stability of Libya, the transition towards elections, as well as from the stability of Libya depends the stability of North Africa and the continental Africa, which is an area of great interest from the Italian perspective as well from the Turkey perspective. You know, Giorgia Meloni, since she came to power, she sealed this so-called Mattei Plan for Africa, so main involvement of the Italian companies, Italian actors in Africa in order to guarantee stability as well, containing the challenges, as well as Turkey is one of the key actors in Africa. So in terms of further strengthening the complementarities and synergies cooperating there as well. Besides, as you mentioned, economy and energy were discussed. And when it comes to energy, also going back to the Memorandum of Understanding signed back in 2019 on the delimitation maritime zone and the exclusive economic zone between Libya and Turkey, I do believe that Italy has great interest on that overall by sharing the know-how in terms of offshore abilities and capabilities. Already back in April in Rome, along with the presidential visit of President Erdogan to Meloni, there was a business forum. And in that business forum, it was discussed about circular economy and energy, and already the synergies and the cooperation between the Italian companies and the Turkish companies in the so-called Eastern Mediterranean was still on the table and was a concrete point to start further. So I do believe that in this time, where everything became transactional, and as we said before, everything is full of vulnerabilities and unpredictabilities, The cooperation between Turkey and Ankara considers the two axes within the Mediterranean is going to be much more stronger than before. And also, both of them, they're sort of guarantor of the stability of the region. And when we speak about stability, of course, the attention, the focus should be Libya. And I do believe that the format that we have seen in Istanbul, I mean the trilateral meeting, is not just a hotspot diplomatic activity, but is going to be a much more organized multilateral framework where the three actors will convey in terms of cooperation, and eventually they will extend the norms toward some other actors involved in the region.
Mustafa, if we can put Turkey, Italy, and Libya on one side, then we can also see that there's Greece, Israel, and Egypt. That's another alliance. Now, there are some concerns that were raised by the Greek side. What were they, Mustafa, and why is Greece being unsettled by the deals and the talks and the summits that are taking place in Turkey?
Well, in 2019, Turkey signed a maritime deal with Libya, and it changed the whole geopolitical situation in the Middle East. And Turkey's growing in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Turkey's growing geopolitical influence in the region, I think, is pushing Greece's buttons. As you know, Turkey has been always calling for fair sharing of the natural resources located in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in this geopolitical equilibrium, there is also another actor, and it is the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. As you know, Turkey has been always calling for the recognition of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus by the international community. And right now, no one except Turkey is recognizing the legitimate rights of the Turkish Cypriot people living on the island. On the other hand, Turkish Cypriot President Ersin Tatar is always reiterating that there are two separate nations living on the island right now, and one nation is a Turkish Cypriot nation, and the second nation is the Greek Cypriot nation. On the other hand, we know that Greece and Greek Cypriot administration have been always pursuing maximalist political stance in the region, and Turkey has been always saying that there will be a fair sharing of natural resources in the region, and Turkey is trying to strengthen its bilateral or multilateral cooperation with regional stakeholders in the Eastern Mediterranean. And within this context, this month, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan welcomed both Italian Prime Minister and Libyan Premier to discuss the geopolitical situation in the region. Right now, I think that Italy is also giving its strong support for Turkey's claims in the region. I think that cooperation and collaboration among regional stakeholders will yield positive results in terms of bringing peace and stability to the Eastern Mediterranean. But we know that Greece and Greek Cypriot administration are not in favor of dialogue or diplomacy right now. They are still insisting on their maximalist policies. Turkey has been always calling for good neighborly relationships with Greece, because we know that Turkish and Greek relations have their up and downs in the historical process. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan has been engaging with his Greek counterparts to discuss the bilateral disputes or multilateral security situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. Yes, Turkey has been always calling for good neighborly relationships with Greece, but it doesn't mean that Turkey will allow any fait accompli in the region.
Valeria, a few months ago, Baykar signed a deal with Leonardo on producing UAVs, and then earlier, Baykar also acquired Piaggio Aerospace. Now, how important are these business deals and these relationships for the longevity of the ties between the two countries?
Well, those are pretty much important. Actually, I call it as the peak of the golden relations between Turkey and Italy, because for the first time, Turkish drone and Turkish manufacture will be produced in Italy and within the European territory. So also in an enlarged scope, for the sake of the security and the defense of Europe, this is of crucial importance. Definitely in the last months, in the last year, we've been seeing growing these relations between Turkey and Italy. The relations has been always very good and very positive. No main crisis have ever erupted between the two actors. But business and also the strategic dossier have been the glue of these relations, and it was evident in the past months. When I speak about business, in the last year we have seen an escalation in terms of bilateral exchange. Just to provide you some data, in 2019 the bilateral exchange was around $19 million. Then it rose to $23 billion, and at the beginning of this year it reached $32 billion, meaning going far beyond the set goal of 30,000 as it was discussed along with the 2023 bilateral meeting between Erdogan and the time Prime Minister Mario Draghi. So, I mean, business is a real engine of these complementarities, but business should not be read just through the lenses of economy. I mean, this matters, but also it has an important impact in terms of strategy and synergies, because anything we are witnessing nowadays, so Leonardo and Baykar agreement, Piaggio and Baykar purchasing, means a further strengthening in terms of supply chain, and also a sort of putting together two different systems. So integration of Turkey within the European system, and also the integration of Italy within the Middle Eastern system or the African system, when Turkey is playing a crucial role. And this is the only way in terms of middle power. I do consider Turkey and Italy as a middle power to keep a sort of stability at international level, and also to mitigate the tensions and the challenges coming from the international instability and this international volatile environment. And I do believe if we look from the European perspective, Turkey is rising as one of the main security providers to Europe. If we look from the Middle Eastern or African perspective, together Turkey and Italy can be the new axis of the stability.
Valeria, when we're talking about this region, there's so many issues. It's a region filled with crisis. We know what's been happening in the occupied Gaza Strip. Then there are tensions between Iran and Israel. There are the Houthis, then the Saudis, then the Emiratis and the UAE. This region is filled with crisis at this point. But one country which successfully overcame all these troubles at the beginning of this year was Syria. And next month, there are going to be elections. And under the leadership of Ahmed al-Shara, do you think that Syria is going in the right direction, or there needs to be some other aspects to this issue? Because the Syrian crisis, we've seen over the past 14 years how refugees came to Turkey, how the Turkish government helped them, and now the country is back on its feet. Do you expect these elections, these parliamentary elections, to bring further peace and stability in the region? Because we've also seen that sanctions have been removed by the US and by the European Union. So what's your analysis on these upcoming elections?
So Syria should be read as a successful story in this turmoiled Middle East, thanks to some extent to Turkey, which has been a main stakeholder for the stability of the new Syria. But definitely there are some challenges. I do believe that if we look inside Syria, many of the tensions of the Middle East are there. So also in Syria we have seen Israel acting aggressively in some of the southeastern territories, attacking also more recently Damascus and some very sensitive target and political target. Still Russia influence to some extent is there, some position close to the Mediterranean. But I do believe that what's happening in Syria really resembles the new balance of power in the region, and also the sort of balance of influence in the region as well. There is a sort of competition, if I may, between the Turkish leadership and there was also the Iranian leadership before, that it was pretty much marginalized. But nowadays the main threat, I think, it comes from Israel as a regional actor and its proxy, as well as domestically one of the threats may be posed by the Kurdish militias as well. I mean, we know that in Turkey a genuine process for normalization with PKK is going on, and it has been effective so far. We know that the PKK has the sister organization acting in Libya in Syria, as well, and many negotiations are going on in order to normalize the situation and to include those groups within omnicomprehensive security bodies. But still some clashes and divergent interests may erupt. So I do believe that the balance is still fragile, but if managed well under the lead of Ankara, of Turkey and the Turkish government, and under the leading of some other regional actors, pivoting on the fact as well that international community and the West is trusting this new process because they lifted the sanctions. So it means that they trusted Turkey as well, and what the current Syrian president is doing, we may lead towards a new direction, but being aware that the challenges are many.
Mustafa, some final thoughts from you. How important is Syria's how important are these elections? And tell me about the Israeli issue here. Do you think that the Israelis could jeopardize the upcoming elections? Because they have been constantly attacking the Syrians. They have been targeting Syrian territories. They have been targeting Syrian institutions. Tell me about that. Just very briefly, how important is, for Syria to counter the Israelis at this point?
Mar, since December, Syrian rulers have been taking important steps to ensure Syria's political sovereignty and territorial integrity. On the other hand, as you know, Turkey has been always reiterating its strong support for Syrian efforts to rebuild and reconstruct a war-torn country. On the other hand, Israeli decision makers think that there is a geopolitical vacuum in southern Syria right now, and Israel is not only taking aim at Palestinian people living in the occupied territories, they are also targeting other countries' territorial integrity and political sovereignty. We know that they are attacking Lebanon, they are striking Yemen, and they are still taking aim at Syria's southern provinces. As you know, last month, Israel militarily intervened in the political situation in the southern part of country under the pretext of the protection of the Druze community. And it is evident that Turkey's rising geopolitical influence in Syria is also pushing Israel's buttons. As you know, Netanyahu publicly called on U.S. President Donald Trump to deal with Turkey's geopolitical influence in the Middle East. But on the contrary to expectation of Netanyahu, Trump publicly sided with Turkey and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and he called upon Netanyahu to be reasonable if Israel wants to deal with its bilateral or multilateral security problems with Turkey. Turkish decision makers reiterate at every opportunity that Turkey doesn't want any military confrontation with Israel over Syria, but at the same time they are reiterating Turkey's strong determination to protect its national security interests in the region. We know that there is terror-free Turkey initiative right now. It also means that terror-free region. Turkey has successfully completed many counter-terrorism operations against PKK terror group within and beyond its borders. And right now, I think that if PKK terror groups, Syrian offshoot, PYD, YPG, tries to establish any separate structure in the northern part of the country, I think that Turkish military forces will be compelled to pursue another counter-terrorism operations in the region in terms of ensuring Turkey's border security.
Mustafa Kocakinar, thank you so much for that analysis. And Dr. Valeria Gianotta, thank you so much for being in the studio with us on this
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Mark.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.